Buildings remember things people forget. Old ice houses remember in cold, long after anyone still living knows why. Bertram O'Yelleran had spent 22 years learning to read that particular cold inside Halloway and Burn Brewing Company, a regional craft brewery operating out of a converted 1902 ice house, whose original purpose had been forgotten by nearly everyone who worked there. He was 58 now, cellar master and facilities keeper, responsible for the aging cellar's climate stability, the barrel racks lining its walls, and the slow, patient chemistry of beer maturing in wood for months at a time in a room built for an entirely different century's technology. He had learned to trust the cellar's temperature from a man named Augustine Reyes, who had kept the cellar for 19 years before him and who believed, without needing to argue the point, that a cellar which couldn't hold even temperature everywhere was quietly telling you where its old bones didn't match its current use. Bertram started at Halloway and Burn at 36, hired as Reyes' assistant during a period when the brewery was expanding its barrel-aging program faster than anyone had fully planned for. Reyes was 60 then, methodical and unhurried, a man who walked the cellar every morning with a simple thermometer in hand, the way other men checked the mail. This building used to keep ice cold before anybody had a compressor, Reyes told him, during Bertram's first week, the two of them standing in the dim cellar between rows of resting barrels. Nobody remembers that anymore. But a building doesn't forget what was built to do. It just stops telling anybody, unless somebody's still walking around with a thermometer. Reyes kept a temperature logbook. Daily readings taken at each rack section throughout the cellar, a discipline the brewery never required of him. He kept it because he believed the cellar that couldn't hold even temperature everywhere was reporting something real, and somebody needed to be listening. Bertram remembered his first week shadowing Reyes on a morning walk, watching him record the same 8 rack sections in the same order every single day, the numbers barely changing from one entry to the next. He'd asked, honestly curious, why anyone needed to write down a temperature that never really moved. Reyes had finished his entry before answering, capping his pen with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. Because someday one of these numbers is going to move when it isn't supposed to, he'd said. And when it does, I want to already know what normal looked like instead of trying to remember it after the fact. When Reyes retired, he left Bertram the logbook, along with a piece of advice Bertram had carried for 22 years since. Walk every section the same way, every day. If one spot won't match the rest, that spot has a reason. Old buildings don't get moody. They just remember things differently than we do. Halloway and Burn Cellar occupied the below-grade level of a building constructed in 1902 as a commercial ice house, back when natural ice cut from northern lakes was packed and insulated through the warm months for sale to households and businesses before mechanical refrigeration made the whole industry obsolete. The brewery had converted the space decades later, drawn to its below-grade cool and its thick original insulation, without anyone at the company ever having much reason to research exactly how an ice house of that era had been built. Bertram knew the cellar the way he knew his own morning routine. He knew which drain grate needed clearing after a heavy cleaning cycle, and which barrel racks with flooring had been replaced twice due to ordinary wear. He knew the particular smell of the space, wet oak, must, and something colder and mineral underneath it that never fully went away no matter how the ventilation ran. He knew the low hum of the climate control compressors and the rhythm of their cycling through a normal day. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that rack section 7, along the cellar's east wall, ran measurably cooler than every other section in the building. IT wasn't dramatic. Most of the brewery staff never thought about it at all. But the quality team had learned, quietly and informally, to avoid section 7 for anything requiring precise, repeatable conditioning, because barrels aged or consistently finished differently than identical barrels aged everywhere else in the cellar. Subtle differences in character that experienced tasters could identify blind, even if nobody could fully explain why. One longtime blender, new to the company years back, had once asked Bertram outright why nobody used Section 7 for flagship barrel program, despite it having some of the best positioned racking in the whole cellar. Bertram had shown her the 2-degree gap on his thermometer, and she had shrugged, filed the barrels thereunder, house quirk, and never asked again, the same way everyone eventually learned to work around it, without ever tracing the quirk back to a cause. Reyes' earliest entry about it, dated 1999, read, Asterisk section 7 still 2 degrees under everywhere else. Insulation checked, ductwork checked, nothing different on paper. Something behind. That wall holds cold different than the rest of this old ice house. Watching it, asterisk. Bertram had read that entry during his first winter with the logbook, sitting in the small cellar office with the compressors humming steadily nearby, and had felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Reyes had noticed something real. Reyes had never solved it. And Reyes had kept measuring anyway, week after week. Patient enough to record a pattern he never got to finish explaining. Bertram continued the weekly readings without ever being asked to. Every week. The same thermometer, the same rack sections, the same 2-degree gap at section 7. He noted it the way Reyes had, plainly, in the same logbook. The pattern held. Week after week, year after year. In his 10th year with the logbook, Bertram began doing something Reyes's simpler entries had never quite included, charting the exact temperature differential at section 7 against the rest of the cellar, rather than simply confirming the gap existed. It took him nearly a decade of those precise weekly readings to see what Reyes's rougher notes could only imply. The gap wasn't holding steady at 2 degrees. It was widening. A small fraction of a degree more each year, slowly enough that any single season's readings looked unremarkable, unmistakable once laid out across 10 years of careful numbers. Section 7 wasn't simply cold. It was getting incrementally colder relative to the rest of the cellar, in a building whose original ice house purpose nobody currently on staff had ever had reason to think about twice. He sat with that realization one evening in the cellar office, Reyes's oldest logbook open beside his own decade of charted readings, the compressor cycling steadily beyond the door. 2 men, 1 section of wall. 25 years of the same patient question. Neither of them ever quite ready to call it solved, and neither of them ever willing to stop asking it either. If the widening gap had been happening since Reyes's first 1999 entry, something behind that section of wall had been quietly, patiently working against the rest of the cellar's climate for at least 25 years. And if the trend extended further back than either man's records, possibly for far longer than that. He thought about every barrel that had ever rested in section 7, without anyone questioning why it finished a little differently. An entire quality department quietly working around a discrepancy nobody had ever traced to a cause. Decades of careful brewing decisions, quietly built around a building's private, unexplained habit, and only 2 men in the company's history who had ever bothered to measure it precisely rather than simply accommodate it. He wrote a new entry beneath Reyes's oldest one. In the same plain hand, Astor's 10 years of weekly charting confirmed the section 7 gap is not stable. It is widening, slowly, consistently, 'cause still unknown, continuing to measure, asterisk. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Bertram had a theory, in his 14th year, that the cause might be a section of degraded insulation in the cellar's more recent climate control retrofit, a patch installed during an earlier renovation that might have settled or compressed unevenly over the years, thinning at exactly the wrong spot. He spent the better part of summer having the retrofit insulation around Section 7 inspected and, where questionable, fully replaced with modern material, confident he had finally found something a contractor could permanently correct. The gap persisted afterward, unchanged, continuing its slow widening exactly as his 10-year chart predicted. The new insulation had nothing to do with it. Whatever was holding that section colder wasn't in the retrofit layer at all. It was somewhere deeper, behind the wall. In the original 1902 construction, nobody had opened in over a century. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the logbook, in the same unembellished style Reyes had taught him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Asterisk retrofit insulation theory. Ruled out. Full replacement installed. Gap unchanged and on trend. The cause is original to the building, not the modern climate system. Back to unexplained. Asterisk. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the retrofit insulation to be the answer, modern, replaceable, a summer's labor and a closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere inside a wall built during the McKinley administration, in a structure nobody at the brewery had ever thought to research beyond its obvious usefulness as a cool, below-grade space. The expansion announcement arrived in his 18th year. The brewery approved a plan to convert an adjacent storage area into additional aging capacity, extending the same climate control system into a wall shared with Section 7, treating the expansion space as a simple continuation of the existing cellar, without investigating why Section 7 had always behaved differently from everywhere else. Bertram read the project brief and felt an old unease sharpen. The new space would depend entirely on the kind of climate consistency the whole investment was meant to guarantee. If something behind Section 7's wall had been quietly working against even temperature for over a century, extending new infrastructure into a wall shared with that same unexplained anomaly risked introducing the same instability into brand new aging capacity. Before a single barrel was ever racked there, he brought Reyes's logbook, along with his own decade of charted readings, to the HVAC contractor managing the expansion. The contractor, a capable and straightforward man named Foster Calloway, reviewed the cellar's insulation specifications and ductwork layout alongside Bertram's data at a folding table set up near the aging racks. Section 7's climate equipment is identical in spec and condition to every other section, Calloway said, tracing the ductwork schematic with one finger. If there were a real equipment issue, I'd expect the readings to show it, and they don't. Honestly, this reads like a minor, harmless quirk of the building's age, a 100-year-old ice house being a 100-year-old ice house. The new expansion's modern climate system should simply absorb whatever this has always been. The gap isn't staying the same, Bertram said. I've charted it for 10 years. It's getting wider every single year, even though every piece of equipment along that wall tests completely normal. A harmless old building quirk doesn't widen on a schedule. Something behind that wall is still active. Calloway considered that, and to his credit, didn't dismiss it outright. I don't have another explanation for a trend like that, but equipment that tests sound doesn't give me grounds to treat this section differently in the expansion plan. The project scope is extending the existing system, not an open-ended investigation into a wall that's passed every check we can run against it. It was a reasonable position, and Bertram didn't have an engineering credential to argue against it. What had was 25 years of a widening gap that had survived a full insulation replacement, and a growing conviction that a century-old ice house might still be keeping a secret nobody currently employed there had any reason to suspect existed. Bertram didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. What if Calloway was right, and 25 years of careful charting amounted to nothing more than an old building's harmless idiosyncrasy, a pattern he and Reyes, between them, had slowly turned into a mystery through nothing but 2 careers of stubborn measurement? He had wanted, for years, for the widening gap to mean something real. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He pulled Reyes's 1999 logbook out one more evening and reread the entry under the cellar office's single desk lamp. Asterisk something behind, that wall holds cold different than the rest of this old ice house. Watching it, asterisk, Reyes had never known the cause either. He had simply kept measuring, week after week, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Bertram had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether it could stand against a clean equipment inspection and a reasonable contractor's assessment. He didn't have the cause confirmed. But not having it hadn't stopped Reyes from writing the first entry in 1999, and it wasn't a reason for Bertram to stop now. Not with new climate infrastructure about to be extended into a wall his own decade of numbers said was still hiding something. He requested, at his own initiative, a single day with a building historian and a thermal specialist before the expansion's ductwork extension began. Not to delay the project, he made clear, only understand what was actually behind Section 7's wall, while the question could still be asked before new construction sealed it away further. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed older industrial buildings for hidden original construction features. She reviewed whatever historical records a brewery possessed alongside a set of 1902 icehouse construction drawings she located through the county's archive, cross-referencing them against Bertram's decade of charted temperature data, and she brought thermal imaging equipment and a small borescope to examine the wall behind Section 7 through a narrow access point. What she found explained 25 years, and likely far more, of a gap that nobody currently at the brewery had ever been able to name. The 1902 drawing showed a small insulated ice storage void directly behind Section 7's wall, a chamber originally built to hold packed natural ice reserves through the warmest months. Sealed off and abandoned once mechanical refrigeration made the practice obsolete decades before Reyes had ever been hired, and never recorded on any drawing the brewery had inherited when it converted the building. "There's still material in there," Priya said, showing Bertram the borescope footage on a laptop propped at the edge of the cellar. Compacted ice melt residue, and what looks like the original insulating sawdust layer packed around it. This chamber has been sitting here, sealed and forgotten, for over 100 years. It's still acting like a cold sink, its own thermal mass, still slowly shifting as that old insulating material settles and compresses even now. That's your 2-degree gap. That's why it's been widening. This isn't a building quirk. It's the building still doing exactly the job it was built for, whether anybody remembers asking it to or not. Reyes never knew any of this existed. Bertram said quietly. Nobody did. Priya said. The brewery inherited a converted ice house, and only ever thought about the parts of it that were useful. This chamber was never useful to anyone after 1902. It just never stopped being cold. Bertram looked at the borescope image again. A century-old chamber packed with material nobody had touched in a workforce that had never heard a craft beer sealed it shut. He thought about Reyes's line, delivered so plainly it had taken Bertram years to hear the full weight of it. A building doesn't forget what was built to do. Reyes had meant it as an observation about attention and patience. He hadn't known, any more than Bertram had, that in this particular building it was also simply, literally true. It's still doing its job, Bertram said. Nobody ever told it to stop. Priya's findings went to Brewery's ownership within the week. Foster Calloway reviewed the historical drawings and thermal footage personally and called Bertram afterward. "You were right to push for this," Calloway said. Every piece of modern equipment along that wall was telling the truth. None of it had any way to see a century-old ice chamber nobody knew was there. If we'd extended the climate system into that shared wall. Without finding this, the new expansion space would have inherited unpredictable temperature behavior from something built before electricity reached most of the city. The expansion plan was revised. The old ice storage void was properly assessed, cleared of its remaining century-old material, and thermally isolated from both Section 7 and the new expansion space before any ductwork extension proceeded. The additional aging capacity was built afterward, finally separated from a cold sink nobody at the brewery had ever known was quietly still working. Calloway and Byrne filed a formal note in its facilities archive, crediting both Augustine Reyes' original 1999 observation and Bertram's 22 years of continued measurement as the reason a forgotten structural feature had been found and properly isolated before new construction extended its influence into space, depending entirely on consistency. Bertram kept Reyes's logbook. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving it into the brewery's permanent archive. Asterisk old ice storage void behind Section 7 assessed and isolated this year. Origin traced to the original 1902 ice house construction, forgotten since mechanical refrigeration made it obsolete, documented informally through temperature drift since 1999. First season on record with Section 7 matching the rest of the cellar. Augustine, you were right. This building never stopped remembering what it was built to do. Neither of us knew what it was still doing for a very long time. Asterisk. He walked Section 7 on a quiet morning not long after, thermometer in hand, the reading matching every other section in the cellar for the first time in the building's working memory as a brewery. He thought about Reyes, walking the same cellar decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that a building doesn't forget what was built to do. It just stops telling anybody unless somebody's still walking around with a thermometer. Bertram had carried that sentence through 22 years, through a ruled-out insulation theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of quiet measurement had amounted to anything more than habit. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep walking the cellar, the way Reyes had taught him, until the building finally admitted what it had been quietly doing since long before either of them was born.